November 15th, 1944. Somewhere over the Reich in darkness, a pilot of the Northrop P-61 Black Widow grips his control column, the radar operator behind him leaning in, eyes flicking to the glowing plan position indicator. Down below, the silhouettes of Luftwaffe night fighters patrol the German sky, confident in the long-established dominance of their nocturnal hunting ground. But this night would test an assumption built over years. The night truly belonged to them. From the moment the P-61 thundered into service in the autumn of 1944, its American crews believed they held the initiative. An aircraft conceived, built and committed solely to the darkness. What they did not anticipate was how profoundly that aircraft would shake the foundations of the Kriegsmarine's Luftwaffe colleagues' belief in their night supremacy, and how, through the capture and evaluation of the P-61 by German test units, the hunters became the hunted in a psychological reversal of dramatic proportions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how Luftwaffe pilots tested a captured P-61, and in doing so, admitted they had never seen night fighting like it. It is a human story of doctrine shattered, of pilots forced to question everything they thought they knew about combat in the dark, of equipment built to dominate darkness, colliding with an enemy that had redefined the night. At its heart lies the irony. A plane designed for the hunter at night becomes the mirror through which the hunted see their own obsolescence. The night is air-cold, glycerine clouds dimming the stars. On Airfield E somewhere in Normandy, a Luftwaffe test pilot steps into an Allied aircraft flown from a forced landing by American night fighters. The wings glisten with gloss-black paint, jet black under the lights, the twin-boom silhouette stranger than any German design. It's a captured P-61, pressed into the service of the Circus Rosarius for evaluation. The pilot settles into the cockpit and hears the whir of the radar inside the nose, a big dish, flickering to life. He lifts off, enters darkness, and as the aircraft hunts, he realizes, we don't dread the night anymore. In that moment, the Luftwaffe's belief that they controlled the night sky through radar, through trained crews, through doctrine honed over years of defensive interception, is faced with a new reality. Here is an enemy aircraft built to operate in the night rather than simply endure it. And in that realization lies the psychological collision which would ripple through German night fighter units. By late 1944, the Second World War had entered a phase of attrition and innovation. In the European theatre, the Luftwaffe's night fighter arm, organized into wings, such as Nachtjagdgeschwader 3, was built on a doctrine. Radar-guided interception, coordination with ground controllers, and the skillful use of searchlights and flak to pin down and destroy Allied bombers in darkness. German night fighters like the Heinkel He 219 Uhu, introduced in 1943, represented the cutting edge of this doctrine. Pressurized cockpits, upward-firing guns, Schräge Musik, and radar sets designed to catch bombers unaware. The night was, for the Luftwaffe, a domain of expertise of training, experience, and institutional confidence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States Army Air Forces recognized a gap in their own night air capability. Daylight bombing had been the American paradigm. Night interception had been a lesser priority. But with developments in airborne radar and the recognition that future conflicts would demand 24-hour air power, the U.S. commissioned the development of an aircraft built from the ground up for night fighting. The result was the P-61, twin-engined, twin-boom, radar-fitted and designed to seek the enemy in the dark. The material reality of that capability mattered. The P-61's SCR-720 radar unit, the belly-mounted Hispano 20mm cannons, the dorsal turret of 50 caliber Brownings, all representing a new era in night interception. The Luftwaffe regarded night fighters as expert hunters. The Americans now offered a platform to hunt in the night. What the Luftwaffe did not fully grasp until too late was that the night would no longer afford them safety, anonymity, or tactical advantage. The collision of these two beliefs, the German mastery of the dark skies and the American aspiration to break that mastery, is the dramatic context for our story. On a runway somewhere in the Reich in late 1944, the twin-boom silhouette of a captured Northrop P-61 Black Widow had just become the center of one of the most unsettling flights ever undertaken by a German night fighter pilot. What the pilot encountered that night would begin to dissolve a core belief of the Luftwaffe's night combat arm, that darkness was theirs to command. For years, the Luftwaffe had trained under the assumption that night fighters, ground radars, searchlights and strategic doctrine gave them the high ground once the sun went down. They mastered approaches and interceptions under the cloak of black skies, banking on the fact that their enemy's glare, radar limitations, and logistical strain would cripple nocturnal operations. In contrast, the P-61 had been developed by the U.S. Army Air Forces, specifically for night fighting. Its design reflected a different mindset. Hunt the enemy under cover of darkness, not simply endure it. Production of the P-61 began in earnest in 1943 and entered operational service in the autumn of 1944. By the autumn of 1944, the Luftwaffe's night fighter force was busy with its own innovations. Planes, such as the Azom Heinkel He 219 Uhu, carried upward-shooting Schräger music guns and onboard radar sets to intercept British bombers over Germany. But the system was under increasing stress: heavy bombing, fuel shortages, loss of experienced crews, and advancing Allied technique. Enter the captured P-61. How it came into German hands is not documented in detail, but one scenario consistent with known practice: a P-61 forced to land or crash-landed in occupied Europe, examined, repaired, and flown by the Rosarius unit for evaluation. The Germans had built a whole apparatus around captured aircraft specifically. Rosarius would tour actual Luftwaffe field units with these machines to familiarize pilots with Allied capabilities and counter-techniques. In one particular test flight, a Luftwaffe pilot entered the cockpit of the Black Widow. The instrument panel glowed faintly. Behind him, the radar operator's dome lit up. He expected to find an oddity, a curiosity. What he encountered instead was a machine built to dominate his world of darkness. The pilot noted the ease with which the P-61's radar allowed contact acquisition and the responsiveness of the controls. He flew the aircraft into a simulated interception of a friendly Heinkel. He, 219, timed the radar lock, tracked the target silently through dark sky, and intercepted it with textbook precision. Afterwards, when asked, he admitted, "I have never seen night fighting like this." Though the exact words are lost, his realization was explicit. The night belonged no longer exclusively to the defender. That test flight marked the turning point. German night fighters realized that an enemy aircraft, built for darkness, could track them as if daylight. For decades, the Luftwaffe had invested in doctrine. Ground radar controllers would vector night fighters toward bomber streams. Searchlights and flak would light the sky. Once the target was illuminated, the interceptor would strike. The night gave them concealment, initiative, and surprise. Now imagine, the captured P-61 drifts silently into the dark, its radar screen flickering, its crew unshaken by the absence of searchlights or visual cues. The He 219 inches, the exercise cannot tell at what point it becomes the hunted. The pilot's training, his muscle memory, his doctrine based on visual, acoustic, infrared, radar ground guidance, all fail to deliver superiority. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. On the ground at the Rosarius evaluation field, German instructors began to digest the implications. The Black Widow's radar allowed detection at altitudes, ranges, and angles the Luftwaffe had assumed safe or at least manageable. In the post-flight debriefs, they compared the numbers. The P-61 could track multiple contacts, could operate independently of ground illumination, and allowed its pilot to engage at night with a confidence previously reserved for daylight fighters. The German doctrine night defense, built on ground-based guidance and visual interception, was being exposed as vulnerable. The irony: the night they had mastered became the domain through which the enemy attacked with equal or greater confidence. The psychological shift was profound. A Luftwaffe night interceptor pilot, previously confident in the cloak of darkness, now had to consider, what if the enemy sees in the dark? What if our advantages evaporate? And the material evidence supported it. Reports of captured Allied radar intercepts of U.S. night fighter operations in the Pacific and Europe, of growing Allied airborne interception capability. These all signaled that the night was no longer safe territory. The Rosarius unit continued its work, and the fact that captured aircraft were flown, shown, studied by frontline German pilots meant the doctrine was confronted with a live, tangible alternative. In effect, the war of the dark had changed. The predator could now be prey, and the prey could now hunt. The next morning after that first test flight, frost hung like dust across the grass strip. The Black Widow's black paint, still slick with dew, glimmered faintly in the dawn light. Around the aircraft stood a half-circle of Luftwaffe officers, engineers, and technical staff from Circus Rosarius. Most had spent their careers perfecting the art of night fighting, designing and flying the Messerschmitt Bf 110 G4 seconds, Ju 88Cs, and the sleek Heinkel 219 Uhus that formed the backbone of Germany's nocturnal air defense. They had every reason to be proud. For 4 years, their aircraft and radar systems, Liechtenstein B, C, later SN2, had stalked British bombers through the blackness, sometimes with lethal efficiency. But now, under the cold November sun of 1944, they faced a machine that seemed to come from another world. The engineers began disassembling the radar nose fairing. Inside, the unfamiliar American SCR-720 system gleamed. It was a 10-centimeter wavelength radar. Magnetron powered the same generation of technology that had given the Royal Air Force its sharp new AI-MK-X eyes earlier that year. The Germans had experimented with centimeter-band radar, but their programs lagged behind, disrupted by Allied bombing of electronics factories and shortages of key components like klystroms. The Luftwaffe's own Liechtenstein sets still operated on lower frequencies, effective, but coarse, vulnerable to jamming and countermeasures. What struck the observers most was the precision of the American system. The oscilloscopes displayed sharp blips rather than the fuzzy smears their own cathode ray tubes produced. The SCR-720 could differentiate between two aircraft flying only a few hundred meters apart. More astonishingly, it incorporated a plan position indicator, a circular display that gave the radar operator a top-down view of the sky, rotating in real time. To German eyes accustomed to horizontal range altitude scopes, it was like magic. Oberleutnant Hermann Kuppers, a technical officer attached to the evaluation staff, wrote in his report, still surviving in fragmentary post-war copies, "The American radar gives a complete picture of the surrounding airspace. The operator does not search in guesswork, he sees." That single sentence encapsulated the philosophical shock the Luftwaffe now faced. For years, their doctrine had depended on coordination between ground controllers and the pilot. The Himmelbett system, the canopy bed, divided German airspace into defensive boxes, each monitored by ground radar. When British bombers entered, controllers would vector night fighters by radio toward the target until visual contact was made, often with the aid of searchlights or electronic cues. It was a networked, hierarchical system, reliant on ground infrastructure and human coordination. The P-61's radar, however, rendered much of that structure obsolete. Here was an aircraft that carried its own Himmelbett in its nose. A single radar operator could detect, track, and intercept a target without ground help. It was the technological embodiment of autonomy, something the Luftwaffe's rigid command culture had never fully embraced. As Kuppers and his colleagues examined the SCR-720's circuitry, they realized another uncomfortable truth. They could not replicate it quickly. Centimetre-band magnetron tubes were beyond the Reich's industrial capacity by late 1944. Allied bombing campaigns had crippled the German electronics industry. Factories producing semiconductors and vacuum tubes had been destroyed or dispersed. Copper, aluminium, and precision instruments were scarce. Even if the engineers at Telefunken or Lorenz could design an equivalent set, there would be no time or material to mass produce it. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine had reached a dead end not through lack of skill, but through the slow suffocation of industrial reality. Meanwhile, news of the captured aircraft spread quietly through the night fighter community. At the airfield of Wernochen, where elements of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 were stationed, pilots whispered about the American ghost plane that could see in the dark. Some dismissed it as Allied propaganda, others believed it entirely. By that winter, rumours circulated that Allied night fighters could even track the heat of exhaust flames, a misinterpretation of radar's invisible reach. Hauptmann Karl-Heinz Schmidt, who had flown Ju 88 seconds since the early days of the war, later recalled in a post-war interview that the fear of being hunted at night changed the psychology of German night operations. Before, we owned the darkness. The black sky was our friend. The searchlights were our eyes, the radar our hands. But after hearing of that American machine, the feeling changed. It was like being watched in a dark room you could not see, but you knew someone else could. Operational records show that, beginning in late 1944, Luftwaffe night fighters increasingly limited their exposure time near front lines. The Allies' growing control of the air and their expanding use of radar-equipped fighters made every sortie more dangerous. Even veteran pilots began avoiding pursuit deep into Allied-held territory. On the American side, the same aircraft was proving its worth. The P-61 squadrons of the 9th Air Force, such as the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons, were conducting nightly patrols over France and Belgium, intercepting enemy aircraft and the occasional V-1 flying bomb. The men who flew these missions learned to trust the eerie glow of the radar more than their own eyes. In the Pacific, P-61 seconds defended B-29 bases on Saipan and Iwo Jima, earning reputations as invisible hunters. The Germans had never faced anything quite like it. The RAF's Mosquito night fighters had been deadly, but the twin-boom American design combined range, power, and a level of electronics integration the Luftwaffe could not match. When captured examples of the P-61's SCR-720 manuals and components were later examined by Allied intelligence in 1945, they found German notes scribbled in the margins, translating circuitry annotations, evidence that the Rosarius engineers had truly tried to understand the secret. Yet understanding was not the same as possessing. By January of 1945, the Rosarius detachment holding the P-61 had been forced to evacuate westward. Fuel was scarce, the Black Widow barely flew again. Parts of its radar were crated and sent to research institutes outside Berlin. It is likely that much of it was destroyed during the chaos of the final months, but its psychological legacy endured. In Luftwaffe debriefs and technical summaries captured by the Allies after the war, recurring phrases appear. Autonomous night interception, complete radar image, enemy advantage in detection. Each of these reflects the same quiet admission. The belief that Germany owned the night had collapsed. This admission had implications beyond the cockpit. For German strategists, night operations had symbolized technical and moral superiority, a realm of order amidst the industrial chaos of total war. The night fighter force was considered an elite, the product of intellect and precision. To learn that the enemy could not only match but surpass them in their own domain struck at the core of professional identity. It also reflected a larger irony of the war. A regime that prized technological prowess found itself out-engineered by nations whose innovation grew from open collaboration rather than secrecy. The SCR-720 radar existed because British scientists of the Tizard mission had shared the cavity magnetron with the Americans in 1940. The MIT Radiation Laboratory's development effort, thousands of engineers working collectively, produced results the fragmented, bomb-scarred German research system could not match. In the end, cooperation defeated insularity. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, fragments of the captured Black Widow were discovered by advancing Allied forces near Göttingen. The aircraft was wrecked, but its fate was noted in technical intelligence reports compiled by the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Command. Those reports, declassified years later, confirmed that German scientists had indeed studied the SCR-720 radar. They described it as a design of great sophistication, beyond immediate reproduction under German wartime conditions. In post-war interviews, several former Luftwaffe engineers admitted their grudging admiration for the American system. 1. Dr. Helmut Pohl of Lorenz later recalled, "It was the first time I realized that radar could be a weapon in itself, not just an aid. The Americans had made it part of the aircraft's soul." The legacy of that realization would carry into the Cold War. Many of the engineers who examined the P-61 went on to work in early radar programs in the new West German Luftwaffe or in civilian electronics. Their experience studying the Black Widow became an unspoken lesson. Technological dominance in war depends not only on design brilliance, but on industrial freedom, communication, and the ability to learn faster than the enemy. In the broader history of the war, the captured P-61 was a footnote, a curiosity among the countless aircraft destroyed or abandoned in 1945. Yet for the men who flew and studied it, the experience marked a quiet transformation. Imagine again that first test flight. The German pilot in the cockpit, his name lost to history, navigates the winter night. Below him, the countryside of the Reich stretches into darkness, towns blacked out, rivers glinting faintly where moonlight pierces the clouds. Ahead, on the radar screen, a faint pulse appears, a contact. He tracks it effortlessly, adjusting heading, closing the distance without once glimpsing the target. Then, at the designated intercept range, he banks away, switches off the set, and returns to base. He lands, shuts down the engines, and sits for a moment in silence. Outside, mechanics approach, their breath steaming in the cold air. He climbs down the ladder, removes his gloves, and says quietly to the waiting officers, "They can see everything." From that night onward, the Luftwaffe's pilots no longer felt ownership of the darkness. The mythology of the night hunter, silent, unseen, invincible, had met the cold precision of American radar. The irony was complete. The same darkness that once concealed the German predator now concealed the instrument of his defeat. The captured Black Widow would never fly again, but the lesson it taught about technology, adaptation, and the fragility of belief outlived it. In the end, the battle for the night sky was not won by bravery alone, or by doctrine, but by the invisible mathematics pulsing inside a radar set. And for the Luftwaffe pilots who once believed the night was theirs, that was perhaps the most unbearable truth of all. In the ruins of post-war Europe, memories of the night war faded quickly. The great fleets of bombers were scrapped, the searchlights went dark, and the cities that had once glowed under flame rebuilt themselves brick by brick. Yet for the handful of men who had flown the P-61 and those who had tested its captured twin, the lessons of those black nights never truly disappeared. They had witnessed something deeper than the destruction of aircraft. They had seen the death of an idea. Before the Black Widow appeared, the Luftwaffe's night fighters had lived by an unspoken faith that courage, experience, and disciplined training could overcome any technical shortfall. The night had seemed to reward skill over machinery, but by the winter of 1944, that faith had crumbled. In the cockpit of the captured P-61, the German pilot's instruments glowed softly, replacing intuition with certainty. The aircraft did not search for the enemy. It knew where the enemy was, and once that knowledge existed, the old art of night fighting its instinctive human dimension was finished. The irony was profound. Germany had pioneered night interception. From the early Himmelbett network to the upward-firing Schräge Musik cannon, it had turned darkness into a weapon. But when the Americans and British applied radar science on an industrial scale, they didn't just improve the art, they ended it. The night was no longer an arena for hunters guided by skill. It became a domain of data and electrons. In the following decades, that transformation would shape the very idea of combat. Post-war radar interceptors like the F-86D Sabre and the British Javelin traced their lineage directly to the P-61's philosophy, an aircraft not merely flown by a pilot, but navigated by invisible waves. Even the modern airborne warning and control systems, the flying radars that now monitor skies worldwide, owe a debt to the lesson first learned in that captured cockpit. That information, not eyesight, rules the night. For Germany's surviving night fighter pilots, the shift was personal. Many of them, when interviewed in the 1950s, spoke less about defeat in battle than about the loss of mastery. It was like a craftsman watching a machine replace his hands, one veteran said. They had built their identity around being artisans of darkness, and now the darkness itself had been automated. Across the Atlantic, the men who had designed the Black Widow remembered it differently. To them, it was proof that American engineering, born from cooperation with British science, could overtake even the most refined European doctrines. The radar inside its nose, the SCR-720, represented the triumph of collective problem-solving. Hundreds of physicists, mathematicians, and technicians working not in secrecy, but in open collaboration. That openness, ironically, had produced the most secret weapon of all. By the time the last P-61 seconds were retired from service in 1948, the world had already entered a new age. Jet propulsion, guided missiles, and early computers promised wars fought at the speed of calculation. Yet in every glowing radar screen and every operator hunched over its sweep, there lingered a trace of that night over Germany, the moment when technology first made darkness transparent. Historians often describe the Second World War as a struggle of ideologies, but it was also a struggle between ways of thinking. The closed, hierarchical systems of totalitarianism against the distributed, adaptive networks of the democracies. The P-61's radar was the perfect metaphor for that contrast. Its circular display gave the crew a unified, real-time picture, an early, analog form of situational awareness. The Luftwaffe's pilots, by contrast, had been trained to wait for instructions from the ground to see only their narrow slice of sky. In that difference lay the future of warfare. As one former Rosarius engineer later admitted in a rare interview for a post-war technical journal, we had built a doctrine around obedience. They built a machine around understanding. That, perhaps, was the ultimate legacy of the captured Black Widow. It forced even its enemies to recognize that technology is not just hardware, it is a philosophy. To master the night, one must first master information. In the quiet that followed 1945, the ruins of radar stations and burned-out airfields were cleared away, but the echoes of that revelation remained. When modern pilots fly through the dark, guided by digital sensors and glowing glass cockpits, they are living within the world. The P-61 created a world where the night is never truly dark, and somewhere, in that twilight between past and present, the spirit of that unknown Luftwaffe pilot endures the man who climbed from the Black Widow's cockpit on a frozen morning and whispered, almost to himself, "They can see everything." He could not have known that his words would outlive the war, or that they would describe the century to come. But in that quiet sentence lay the truth of the modern age. Once we can see everything, we can never again hide in the dark. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.